So now, let's let John bring his panelists forward. John?
Thank you very much, Tim. And we do have a fabulous panel here today. Welcome, Steve, who represents kind of the new media world. And some might think that our panelists represent the old media world, but they're going to disabuse you of that notion, believe me. When we started talking about this topic, there was a lot of discussion. And I heard from a lot of people saying, newspapers might be on their way out, might not be around much longer. But the more we talked about it, we realized that, as Mark Twain once said, of himself, that my death may be greatly exaggerated. And that's why I invited these three panelists here today. First, and why don't you all come up and I'll introduce you as you're coming up. First, coming up on his way here, David Boardman, executive editor of the Seattle Times, an old friend and colleague of mine. Dave has oversight and responsibility for the news department of the Times, Washington State's largest newspaper, and its website, seattletimes.com. As an editor of the Times, Dave directed 2 Pulitzer Prize-winning team projects, edited 6 other stories that were Pulitzer finalists, and the Times, a lot of you may have seen the ads, just won the nation's top 3 Associated Press Sports Editors Awards, which was a great achievement for any paper. And I think we can all agree that their coverage of the Winter Olympics was superb. I read it every day. Great stuff. Before joining the Times in 1983, Dave was reporter and editor at the Anacortes American, Skagit Valley Herald, Tacoma News Tribune, graduated from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University, and has a graduate degree in communications from the University of Washington. So, David, welcome. Next, Janet Taylor, publisher of the Bellevue and Mercer Island Reporters. Janet relocated to this area just last April to take on her new role with East Sound Newspaper Operations, Sound Publishing Incorporated. The company bought the King County Journal and now operates all the newspapers, weeklies on the east side. Janet began her career in newspapers in 1988 as a sales representative at the Missoulian in Montana. She was promoted to manager of classified advertising, then director of advertising. In 2006, became publisher of the Montana Standard in Butte. Janet went to the University of Montana, where she studied concert, piano, and drama. More about that maybe later. And finally, our third panelist, George Erb. Yeah, hand for Janet. George Erb is editor of the Puget Sound Business Journal. And on the middle of your tables is a very special offer. George is offering a 5-week free subscription to the Business Journal to anyone who wants to fill out one of his forms. A lot of you are probably already subscribers. George has been an editor-reporter at the South County Journal in Kent, Peninsula Daily News in Port Angeles, the Highline Times in Burien. He's a past chapter president of the Society of Professional Journalists, director on the board of the Washington Coalition for Open Government, member of the State Bench Bar Press Committee. He earned his bachelor's degree in history from Hanover College in Indiana and has a master's in journalism from the University of Oregon. So here's our panel. Welcome all. Now, to give Dave and Janet and George an idea of the audience here, who's in the crowd today, I want to start with just a few quick show of hands questions. So, how many of you read the Seattle Times on paper? Whoa, David. Online. How many of you read it at seattletimes.com? How many both? Both. Okay. The Sound Publishing, one of the weeklies, Bellevue Reporter, Mercer Island Report. How many read one on paper? East Siders, okay. Online. Not as many, okay. Both? Anybody? Okay. Work on that, Janet. Okay. Puget Sound Business Journal. How many read it on paper every week? Wow. Okay. George, I told you weren't going to need all these subscription cards. Online. How many read it online? How many both? Okay. Interesting. How many read other national newspapers? New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. Okay, so this is a newspaper-friendly crowd. How many of you get more news from TV, radio than from newspapers? Anybody willing to admit it? Okay, a few. Okay, the truth. How about some of the hyper-local neighborhood news sites? West Seattle Blog, myballard.com. Okay, how many are fans of those? Okay, that's a growing area, and Dave is going to talk about how they've allied with those groups. Okay, one last question. I do this. I speak to Rotaries all around the state, and I always like to ask this question. How many of you have ever been the subject of a news story? You, your organization, your company, raise your hand. You've been in the news. Okay, now leave your hands up. Okay, leave your hand up if they got it right. Oh my gosh. Okay. This tells you something, doesn't it, guys? Okay. Well, I'm going to start with a few questions to our panelists, and I want to leave time for questions from the audience because I know many of you have them. Okay, you guys, as I said, many people seem to think that newspapers are dying and maybe won't exist in a few years. The State of the News Media 2010, very thorough report, just came out last week from the Project for Excellence in Journalism organization in Washington, D.C., does this every year. Here are some of their findings. Newspapers now spend $1.6 billion less annually on reporting and editing than they did a decade ago. Their resources are down. Newspapers saw their advertising revenue fall 26%. These are nationwide. There's some good signs here. Of the top 200 news sites, legacy media, in other words, mainstream media, newspapers, TV stations, account for 67% of those top 200 sites. So, but only for the third consecutive year, only cable news and digital news saw their audiences grow among the key sectors that deliver news. So we are in a period of transition and uncertainty in the news business these days. And that's why I wanted to have these three panelists here to talk about this. I'm going to ask each of you to answer this question. People seem to think the newspapers are dying and won't exist maybe in a few years, at least on paper. How do you address that concern? How do you respond? What are you doing? What's your 5-year outlook? David, let's start with you.
Thanks, John. And let me say first, John introduced me as the editor of the Seattle Times, but I like to tell people I'm also the editor not only of SeattleTimes.com, but our Twitter feed, our RSS feed, our iPhone app, our BlackBerry app, and I'll come read the paper to you over your breakfast cereal if you like. Actually, there's a lot of misconception about what's going on in the newspaper industry. It is an incredibly challenging time. Obviously, it's also the most exciting time in my career. The most fundamental misconception, and in this crowd, you may not have this misconception, is that people aren't reading newspapers anymore. In fact, there are more people reading Seattle Times content in print, online, on their telephones, than ever before. We don't really have a readership problem. That's not the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is a revenue problem, tied mostly to one simple thing, Craigslist. It's more complicated than that, and certainly it's tied a lot to the economic strains that you're probably all feeling in your businesses. But the most fundamental thing for us was the loss of classified advertising, the want ads for cars and jobs and houses and so on. That was, for a typical metropolitan newspaper like ours, that was it was between 40 and 50% of our advertising revenue. And we've lost about 80% of that, almost overnight. And that's typical for major metropolitan newspapers. So, that's a fundamental structural change that we have to address. We're addressing it in lots of different ways, but we believe that what it is that we offer people, thoroughly vetted, fact-checked, thoughtful journalism is still very much wanted and needed in the marketplace. There's still great hunger for it. We see that in a variety of ways. We're just having to reinvent how it is that the customer pays for that along the line. And that's an evolution more than it's a revolution.
Janet, why don't you take that question on? You have a somewhat different approach.
If we wouldn't have been so arrogant, we wouldn't have lost classified advertising. I came up through classified advertising, and the problems with newspapers, I think, that we are so wanting people to adhere to our way of doing things, because we, and we can't. We have to adhere to what our readers want. And that is really the great challenge of this whole thing. It was why I left Lee Enterprises and came to Sound, because Sound Publishing really wants their news to come from the readers up. And, we got to quit thinking that our model, by gum, you're going to stick to our model because we know what we're doing and we're the experts and we've done this for years and years and years, and people don't want that. And so the organizations that listen to readers and the organizations that embrace new media as their friend instead of their competitor will survive. And we still believe in getting the news to people. And people want news. They want fair and accurate news. That hasn't changed. The word newspapers might go away. Yeah. But, what is it that people want? How do they want to receive it? And it's so broad that for a newspaper with limited resources because of loss of revenue, how do you channel your resources into Twitter and Facebook and apps and online and print too? So I think it's a pretty fun time, and I wish I wasn't so old, because it would be a great time to be a young person starting out in this business and really leading the way into the future.
George, how about you? Puget Sound Business Journal has a niche. How are you guys doing?
We do. We're doing okay, actually. I think to think about newspapers as information gathering companies that gather it and then deliver it to you with ink on paper is actually, in this day and age, too narrow a concept. I think, in general, the newspaper industry has moved past that. In this day and age, many, if not most, newspaper companies deliver their information ink on paper, on the internet, and in many cases with broadcast partners, both on cable television, radio. So what you have essentially at its core is an information or a content company that's now using multiple channels to deliver the message. And the challenge is what's going to be the revenue model for those different delivery points. That's where the head scratching is right now. It's a very disruptive time, but I'm confident that we'll be able to figure it out. And the reason I'm so confident is because, so help me, if you have content that's unique and valuable, you'll find a market for it. And I think that newspapers, be they serving a community or be serving a niche like my paper does, if we have unique and valuable content, we'll be able to sell it and find a market for it and find a way to pay for it.
George, you told me your circulation basically was flat, even in the tough economic times of the last year or so.
Yeah, I checked with the Circ department before I came over here just to make sure to get my facts right, and it's actually up a little bit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's if you look at our Circ numbers, before the Great Recession, we're about 17,500, 18,000, and today it's a little, I can't remember where it is. But it's a little higher. It's about 17,500, 18,000. Now, one thing that's interesting is that we do have a greater proportion, and I don't know what the percentage is, I wish I had that for you, of subscribers that are getting their paper delivered as digital editions. It actually shows up in their inbox as in an electronic format, and you can sort of turn the pages electronically. And we have, I think it might be more than 1,000 subscribers who are buying it that way. It's like it's a virtual paper. I can only expect that percentage is probably going to grow as time goes forward.
David, you're looking at that, those new technologies as well. Could you talk a little bit about what you're doing at the new online newspapers?
I want to make one point about circulation. One of the things we're finding, and it is actually one of the foundations of our optimism, is that there's a conventional wisdom out there that people won't pay for content. Well, we are seeing that people will pay for content. Even as our advertising revenue has declined, our circulation revenue continues to grow. And as if you subscribe at home, as you've seen, we've had to raise the price of the paper a couple of times, and that 50 cents an issue or 75 cents an issue that you pay doesn't begin to actually pay the cost of gathering that news, producing the paper, the ink on paper, and delivering it to your doorstep by 5:30. So we've had to raise that a bit, and we've had very little circulation drop off from that. And in fact, our circulation has grown dramatically, of course, with the demise of the PI. To answer your question, John, yeah, we as George said, we're looking at all sorts of delivery systems. Our theme right now is we want to get news and information to people where they want it, when they want it, how they want it. We very much want to be your 24/7 companion, so that you're reading the newspaper in the morning, checking the website all day long. Our website is not just the newspaper put into electrons, but it's a very dynamic, changing, multimedia, interactive venue. We're looking at, as all newspapers are, we're looking at the iPad and some of these other electronic screens that are in e-readers that will be coming out. We already deliver to the Kindle. There will be many, many ways to get your information. I'm not particularly hung up on the ink on newspaper. I think it has a long life to come, as long as all of us are still around. But when that day is over, that won't be tragic at all. And in fact, if you take the trucks and the ink and the gasoline and the tires and all of that out of the system, and those big monster presses we have up at Bothell, and it's just a matter of sending the information over a satellite to something in your pocket or on your desk, it's a whole lot cheaper. We'll take a lot of the cost basis away, and we'll be able to make this a much more profitable business going forward.
Okay, I mentioned the growth of the hyperlocal news neighborhood websites. Seattle is particularly active in that area, and each of you touched on a little bit, but I wonder if each of you could talk just a bit about what you're doing to embrace this new news ecosystem, which is a term that a lot of people have used. David, tell us what you're doing. You're now up to, what, 27? Is that what you told me?
Yeah, about a year ago. I mean, as you know, a lot of these neighborhood sites are emerging. Some of them are very, very good. I might cite the West Seattle blog and My Ballard particularly are just terrific quality sites run by journalists. And then there are many that aren't so good, that are just dealing in rumor and innuendo. Well, what we've done is partnered with those that we think share our journalistic standards, and rather than to either compete with them or ignore them, we've embraced them as partners, and you can come to seattletimes.com and see news of your neighborhood. We link directly to them so that they get the traffic and the benefit of that. We get the breadth of coverage. We tip each other off to stories, and we're even working on potential business arrangements going forward. And we have 27 of those partners now.
Janet, seattlepi.com has partnered with Sound Publishing, right? So that's not quite what we're talking about, David's talking about, but can you tell us about that? How's that going? And how do you guys make sure that what you get from seattlepi.com is factual and accurate? And is Roger Oglesby here? Sorry, Roger.
It's all about partnerships. I think if there's one thing that the Great Recession will give us all is really learning how to work better together. We've got a great partnership with the Seattle PI. They grab our top-read local stories and put it on their site. And it's tremendous for us on the east side for getting a lot more exposure for our content, and has really helped their users, too, and our users. It's just been a great partnership. We are able to generate revenue by selling advertising on the PI. And so it's, we started talking to them last summer, and the partnership came together right after Christmas this year. So it's been good.
George, you guys are doing some interesting things. How many people read TechFlash? TechFlash.
Oh, nice.
Okay, maybe you could talk about that a little bit, which started as a strictly online part of SeattlePI.com and now is part of Puget Sound Business Journal.
Yeah, TechFlash was an out-of-the-box experiment for us. I mean, the Puget Sound Business Journal and indeed our parent company had never done anything remotely like that before, but it was an opportunity, and we ran for it. And we We launched Tech Flash in October 2008, probably the worst time in the last 50 years to launch anything, but the site has steadily gained readership. For those of you who aren't unfamiliar with the site, Tech Flash is a news blog that covers the tech community, and its principal authors are Todd Bishop and John Cook, who were tech writers that already had their own brand identity and their own name, who came over to us from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer before the paper seized the print edition. And they're the principal authors of Tech Flash, and in fact it's largely their idea. They came to us with a business model, and we said, sure. So that's been one of our big experiments. The Business Journal, the whole discussion of online, it's ongoing, and you can just see the subject sort of rising higher and higher in our list of strategic priorities. And this year, the Business Journal will probably make its greatest investment in online, either on Tech Flash or the Business Journal, in terms of content or in terms of sales. It's a real priority for us. Over on the Business Journal site, because these are two separate sites, we've been working on making the site more robust by putting in more content, more interactive features. We do that in partnership with our parent corporation. We control part of our site. The parent controls the other part of our site, but in recent months, more and more of the control has been given over to the local papers. So we have our hands on more of the levers, so to speak. So that's been a real big priority for us. It's a big experiment. It's a time of a lot of innovation. The things that will work, we'll keep doing. The things that don't work, we'll drop, and you'll probably see that among all the media outlets in the coming years.
I've talked to all of you about this, and you've touched on it a little. And David, as you said, we all need journalism that's accurate, trusted, credible, fact-checked, careful, thorough. In a 24/7 news cycle with all these new technologies, you've got to get it out there quick. There's great pressure. How tough is it now these days to control for fairness, accuracy, balance? Are your editing systems, oversight systems, how have they changed? What are some of the challenges here, and how are you grappling with this?
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, David.
Yeah, it's extremely challenging, and what we have made clear to our reporters and editors is while we would like to be first with news, that is not the most important thing to us. There's an emerging body of thought out there, particularly among websites that are only websites, that there's a new phrase that you hear a lot, it's never wrong for long, and they throw it out there. They throw it out there and then use what they call crowdsourcing, that the crowd will tell them if it's not right. Well, my attitude about that, and what I've said to our reporters is, all it will take is one suicide of somebody who's been wrongly accused, or one business that has been ruined by false information, and we've seen that in a case or two, where we will regret that forever. So that's not our attitude, and it's not our approach. Our approach is we would like to be first. We certainly strive to be first, and I would say we usually are, but being right is far more important to us. And so the approach we're taking is not a balance between speed and accuracy on the web. It's between speed and completeness. So we're taking more of a wire service approach on the web, where we make sure something's right, we'll get it out there, we'll give you the facts that we have confirmed, and then we'll develop the next set of facts. But we won't put anything out there that we don't know or aren't 99.9% sure is correct.
Janet, challenges in the 24/7 cycle?
No. I think that the only difference was, I know for newspapers that the being first to get it online was kind of tough for where I came from for the dailies, because we didn't want the television station to grab it second and say they had it first. So we kind of had to get through that thing. But we, too, believe that, if it takes another hour to confirm the sources and to confirm the story, it's much more important than being the first to have it up there. And the 24/7 news cycle means that editors and publishers, we're working 24/7. I mean, it's not like it used to be, you get called at midnight and stuff like that. But it's more important that we totally agree and work like David does, too.
George, reflections on this challenge?
Yeah, our guide for this is that accuracy is paramount. So we have to make sure that our stories are accurate before we post them, no matter what the competitive pressure is. One of the more interesting conceptual challenges for us at the Business Journal is that most of you know us as the weekly business paper that comes out on Friday, and we've specialized over the years in enterprise reporting. Just a shorthand for saying that we like to do depth and context stories long. We spend a lot of time. Lots of sources or reporters will spend days, sometimes weeks, even months reporting them. The web is not really set up for that right now. The web is more of an immediate medium. You've got to get the information out there fairly quickly. And so we've kind of had to retool the brains of our newsroom because most of our web stories are news breaks, which tend to be pretty short, 4 or 5 paragraphs, as opposed to the stories that you'll find in the paper, which might have, 15 to 20, 25 paragraphs. It's a different kind of reporting. But the accuracy standard applies to both, and if it's not accurate and if we aren't solid about the source of information, we won't go with it.
Here's a new wrinkle. I want to run this by each of you. Citizen blogs, anybody can start a blog. There's a great book called We're All Journalists Now. Came out a couple of years ago. A lot of truth in it. Start a blog. Start writing about whatever you want. Fine. You're doing that on your own. Fine. You're accountable. SeattlePI.com hosts, I don't know how many there are, dozens of citizen bloggers hosted on the SeattlePI.com site. They're not SeattlePI.com staffers. Should they meet the same standards of accuracy, ethics, fairness, balance as everything else on the page? I asked a SeattlePI.com editor to come here to be on this panel, and she declined. But I want to run that by each of you. David, you got some thoughts on this. If you're hosting a citizen journalist, what do you ask of them? Do you vet them? What do you expect of them? What do you demand of them in terms of accuracy, fairness, balance, ethics?
Some of the neighborhood bloggers that we're working with as partners, some of them are fully employed as bloggers, like the woman Tracy Record, who runs the West Seattle blog. Others of them are part-time, more what you would call citizen bloggers, although most of those people have journalism backgrounds. But we bring them in. We make sure we have a standard statement of ethics and standards and practices that they agree to. We give them training if they need training. And we take responsibility. If we post something on our site or link to something, you as a reader are assuming that we're giving it the Seattle Times seal of approval. So I believe very much that you do have to take responsibility for that. I know that PI.com and some other sites feel differently.
Any other reflections on that, Janet or George?
Well, right now we don't have any formal citizen blogs that we manage. We do have blogs on our sites, and it's a lot of information to manage. But yes, we do manage it and have like the George Carlin filter, where it looks at 1,000 different words. There's 1,000 different words that you shouldn't say. So
tell that to Vice President
I
Joe
thought I had
Biden.
a pretty good grasp of. And it'll filter that out. And although we don't edit, we will pull something, and we'll pull something pretty quick on our blogs. There was a story that we broke a couple of weeks ago on the bullying in Kirkland. I don't know if any of you read that story. The blogs and the comments then turned into more bullying for this kid, and we just took the whole thing down. It just wasn't worth it. So.
Commenting, I'm
was my next
differentiating
question.
between
Last
blogging
question, yeah.
and commenting.
Comments threads. At the end of every story now, many stories, most stories, citizens, you can comment immediately, instantly. You don't have to tell your real name. Most of comments, or many, are anonymous. Just today's Washington Post has a big story about this debate. Comments, anonymous or not? Should we be upfront about who we are? Letters to the editor always are verified. You know who wrote it. What's the difference? David, would you talk about your comments policy?
Yeah, we were late coming to the commenting game, as you probably noticed. Certainly much later than the PI opened to comments. For that very reason, that I just wasn't comfortable and felt like the most important thing to me is to protect the dignity of the Seattle Times brand. If you're going to play in our house, you have to behave yourself. My own thinking on that evolved as I saw this is an expected part of the web culture. People feel frustrated if they don't have the outlet, don't have the ability to be interactive. And in fact, we saw early on that comments can be very, very helpful in terms of seeing, learning additional facts on a story, seeing what the questions that people have, serving as a place for community dialogue. Sometimes there's very rich and intelligent conversation there. Sometimes it's anything but rich and intelligent. And what we've done is we've tried to develop through technology the tools so that the readers and commenters can police the territory themselves. It's very easy to report a comment as a violation of our terms, and if it gets 2 complaints, it immediately is brought to the attention of an editor who can take it down immediately, and that happens quite often. If it's a touchy subject, something to do with race, for instance, we'll do one of 2 things. We'll either moderate all the comments, which is very labor intensive, and we'll read every one before it's posted, or we simply won't allow commenting on some stories that we know will just go straight into the gutter. We just won't allow it on stories like that.
Okay, I'm sure you have lots of questions. Where are, we need a mic. Okay. Ralph Monroe.
I just have two concerns I'd like to have you comment on. One is the lack of investigative reporting anymore in the state capitol, which really bothers me, having worked there a lot of years. And secondly, the fact that the blogger can say anything they want, maybe not in your publication, but anything they want, and then it goes on to Google or Bing or whatever, and people pick it up as fact 5 years later, 10 years later.
Is that a specific question, or anyone want to react?
Well, I share your concern on the second one, absolutely. I think it's a tremendous, I share your concern on both, actually, but on the second point, just that bloggers and anybody with a computer can say anything, and it does tend to take on a life of its own and live on forever on the internet, which underscores for me why it's so important for us to get it right. On your first point, you're absolutely right, Ralph, that the press corps in Olympia has been decimated. There are so few journalists now in Olympia watching what's going on there. We have had through this session 3 reporters, which I think is about half the press corps down there, including 2 of our very best, and they do have very strong investigative skills, and we're doing our best to dig there. Additionally, we have a separate investigative team that works out of Seattle that looks at a lot of state issues, the most recent of which you may have seen was our series on the care of elderly and frail people in adult family homes. So we're trying to keep state government on its toes, but it's tough. It was a lot easier to do when there were 20 or 25 reporters in Olympia instead of probably half that.
Question over here, Laura
Thank you for your
Raymond.
time. I have a question really related to what Ralph asked, too. There was talk about a year ago, as we all watched sort of horrified with the demise of journalists at newspapers, there was talk about establishing a nonprofit that would fund investigative reporting around the country, or in some way keep that alive as newspapers lost that talent. Has this gone any further, or are you seeing a return to being able to hire those reporters to cover those long, in-depth stories?
I can take that one. There's a lot of experimentation going on out there right now, both nationally and locally, with all kinds of models, nonprofit models, small mom and pop, for-profit models, grants. There's an interesting model out there of a news organization that would basically get grants, hire reporters, they write the stories, and then they would shop the stories around and provide them to other media outlets that would distribute it that way. Which one is going to end up being the dominant model 15 years from now? Hard to say. But I think it's encouraging that even though that we are in a period of incredible disruption, that it's also a period of a lot of experimentation and innovation, and some of those experiments are probably going to succeed.
I'm on the board of a couple of those nonprofit groups, actually nationally. One that's gotten a lot of publicity that's called ProPublica. and they got an enormous grant from a couple of philanthropists, and they've done terrific work that's appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, and elsewhere. The question is, how long can that be sustained? Those organizations that depend solely on the goodwill of wealthy philanthropists, which many of these do.
There's another fascinating one, just real quickly, spot.us. They're just coming to Seattle. If you have a story idea, you put your proposal on their website and invite people to send in donations to pay for it. They're starting to get some traction. Spot.us, check it out.
I'm interested in how extreme the demographic differences are based on age and what kind of studies have been made as to who is still reading printed newspaper versus web and that type of thing. I'm just curious how much of our younger generation are even reading the printed page.
I can take that one. Well, the kind of the bad news is that newspaper has kind of forgotten 2/3 of the population that kind of gave up on us because we gave up on them. There is a third that are still avid newspaper readers, but my son grew up in a newspaper. I mean, he grew up with me, and he doesn't read a newspaper. When there was a scare going on in Montana, all the spinach had E. coli. I said, "Oh my goodness, I don't know when you're going to read a newspaper, but don't eat the spinach." And he says, "Mom, don't worry. I don't read a newspaper and I don't eat spinach." He likes his. The way he wants his news is pretty quick and fast. Send me some headlines. Give me the headlines, and I'll go online and I'll finish the rest of the story. And he follows things on Twitter and online and Facebook, and that's how he wants his information. He'll read a newspaper when he's kicking back and has nothing else to do. But there's about 2/3 of the population, and they're a economic demographic, and they're an age demographic where we kind of forgot about, so they just gave up on us.
In this area, and as you may have seen in the little cards that we left on your seat, in this area, though, about half the 18 to 24-year-olds do read Seattle Times content either in print or online. Now, most of that, I think, probably is online. But one of the reasons that we've kept so dedicated to high school sports coverage is that that's an area that can really get young people into reading the printed paper. There's nothing like seeing their name in print, their friend's name, their picture, and we dedicate a lot of resource to that.
Got time for one more. Susan Adler.
Thank you, John. This is a question for David Boardman. I fully agree with your opening comments, David, about the time taken for accurate and thoughtful reporting. My experience is that the headlines of some of these stories don't mirror the accuracy of the reporting. And the most cogent example for me is Sandy Doughton's recent piece on a young monkey that had been kept from food by the older monkeys at the primate center at UW. Very thoughtful story, explanation that monkeys behave like this in the wild and so forth. The headline was UW starves monkey. And it's very frustrating when that happens. I don't know why that happens, and I'd appreciate learning more about why that happens.
This is, and I'm sure my colleagues would reinforce this is probably the most common and age-old complaint of newspapers, and that doesn't mean that I dismiss it in the least. It's very important. It's really a hard thing to capture the gist, particularly of a complex story, in 3 or 4 words. And it's just the nature of the beast, particularly in the printed newspaper, as you design a page and you're trying to capture it. That's one reason we send those headlines through a couple of layers and a headline that is, we try to avoid overly sensational or overly simplistic headlines. We certainly don't always get it right. And this is a real important point I'd like to leave with all of you. When you do know about something, if you are somebody who's being written about or you know somebody who was, and you know we didn't get it right, or there's a bad headline, please let us know. We welcome that. We don't cringe at it. We welcome it. The first thing I say to people when they call or write to me with a complaint is, thank you so much. It means so much to me that you cared enough to let us know. And that's the only way we can get better.
And if they don't say that, call the Washington News Council. Headline for today, panel does great job.
Thank you, John, and thank you, panelists. In whatever form newspapers of the future take, your quality content and high standards will always shine through. Thank you for sharing your insight with us today. Thanks again to all of today's program participants. Welcome again to Steve. Next week, March 31st, we're packing our bags and heading 2.5 blocks east to the Convention Center when we'll hear from Ada Healy of Vulcan Real Estate. I've heard they have a couple of projects going down by Lake Union, so her talk might be interesting. The pundits and comedians of every age have always had an observation or two about the Fourth Estate, so today I'll leave you with a couple. The first is from David Letterman, who noticed that the USA Today recently came out with a new survey that apparently showed that 3 out of every 4 people make up 75% of the population. And another from Jerry Seinfeld, who says he's always amazed that the amount of news that happens in the world each day always just exactly fits in the newspaper. Have a great day. We'll see you next week. We're adjourned.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.